In the 1920s Mafia, you could survive a shootout and still get in trouble for sitting in the wrong chair. You could earn millions and still be punished for wearing a suit that looked too expensive. This wasn't random crime. It was a rigid rulebook where greetings, haircuts, dinner etiquette, and even who you made eye contact with could decide your future. Here are 44 bizarre rules the 1920s Mafia actually followed. And some of them are pettier than high school politics. 1. Grammar is usually the least of a criminal's worries, but in the 1920s Mafia, one tiny preposition was the difference between a handshake and a funeral. There was a rigid verbal code for introductions that acted like a binary security clearance. If a wise guy introduced a new face as a friend of mine, it meant he was just a random civilian or a nobody who could be scammed or ignored. But if the phrase was friend of ours, the room temperature immediately changed. That possessive pronoun signaled he was a made man, fully initiated and protected by the family. Messing this up wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was considered exposing the secret society to outsiders, an offense that often led to the blabbermouth disappearing into a swamp shortly after dinner. 2. Perhaps the most ridiculous fashion trend of the Roaring '20s was the belief among gangsters that wearing expensive imported silk underwear could stop a bullet. They genuinely believed that if they were shot, the silk would wrap around the projectile and prevent it from penetrating deep into the flesh, making it easier to pull out. So you had the toughest, scariest men in Chicago walking around in delicate, high-end lingerie beneath their pinstripe suits, convinced it was tactical armor. It is a hilarious image to picture a ruthless enforcer spending a fortune on soft undergarments, not for comfort, but because of a completely pseudo-scientific urban legend about ballistics. 3. Al Capone is famously known for bootlegging, but one of the weirdest rules he pushed for in Chicago was actually about expiration dates on milk bottles. The mob took over the local dairy unions because they had the trucks for distribution, and Capone realized that selling spoiled milk was bad for public relations. He actually lobbied the city council to mandate visible expiration dates on bottles to ensure safety, creating a bizarre reality where a crime boss was more concerned about calcium and child health than the government was. It is a strange historical footnote that the man who ran the underworld is technically the reason you know when your milk goes bad. 4. While they ruled the city, young unmarried mobsters were often strictly required to live with their mothers until they found a wife. It didn't matter if you were a top earner bringing in thousands of dollars a week from bootlegging. If you were single, you slept in your childhood bedroom. This rule was about community image and keeping the young guys grounded, but it created a hysterical contrast. You had dangerous men who spent their nights evading the FBI and their mornings getting yelled at by their moms for not making their beds. It proves that no matter how tough you are still terrified of disappointing your Italian mother. 5. The infamous vow of silence known as omerta was not just a suggestion for legal defense. It was an extreme, almost cult-like rule that defied all logic. Police officers in the 20s frequently encountered a level of stubbornness that was genuinely baffling. There are historical reports of officers finding a mobster who had clearly just been involved in a major incident. Yet when asked what happened, the guy would look the cop dead in the eye and say nobody was there or claim he simply tripped over a rug. Ratting out a rival was considered a massive breach of etiquette because it invited the law into family business. These guys would literally choose to stay silent and protect the very people who ruined their day rather than break the code. 6. One of the most hilarious contradictions of the 1920s mobster was the obsession with delicate hand care. Tough guys like Al Capone, who controlled the streets with an iron fist, would regularly sit for hours getting professional manicures and hot towel treatments. It was a strict rule of appearance that a boss must have soft, clean hands to separate himself from the manual laborers and street thugs. You essentially had hardened criminals, capable of overthrowing city governments, sitting in a salon chair gossiping while a beautician buffed their cuticles to a perfect shine. It is a wildly funny image to picture a room full of dangerous men comparing nail polish buffers and cuticle oils before going out to commit felonies. 7. Imagine a cold-blooded enforcer politely asking his boss for a day off because he has to cover a shift at the local bakery. That was the bizarre reality of the Prohibition-era mafia, which strictly mandated that every single member hold a legitimate, on-paper job. While they were pulling in millions from illegal booze, they were utterly terrified of the federal government tracking their spending. To avoid drawing heat from the taxman, these violent criminals were officially registered as olive oil importers, waste management consultants, or floral delivery drivers. They actually had to maintain fake time cards and file boring tax returns just to create a paper trail. It is incredibly funny to picture a ruthless crime lord sweating over his annual tax deductions just so he could safely drive his brand new Cadillac. 8. A massive civil war actually erupted over facial hair right at the end of the Roaring '20s. The old-school Sicilian bosses who built the American mob were famously called Mustache Petes because they rocked giant, intimidating mustaches as a sign of old-world authority. Enter Lucky Luciano and his younger crew, who absolutely despised the look. To them, those hairy upper lips just screamed uneducated street thug to the public. Luciano instituted a deeply enforced grooming standard where rising stars had to be completely clean-shaven. He wanted his syndicate to look like slick Wall Street executives, not mountain bandits from Palermo. Refusing to shave meant you were clinging to the past. And in this ruthless business, getting left behind usually meant getting buried alive in a cheap suit. 9. For an organization built on illegal money and brutal power struggles, their internal relationship rules were bizarrely rigid. There was an absolute nuclear-level taboo against even casually flirting with another made man's wife. It wasn't about romance. It was about stability. In a world fueled by ego, jealousy was more explosive than dynamite. A careless comment at a dinner table could spiral into consequences nobody wanted. You could feud over territory and settle it through structure, but turning it personal? That was chaos, and chaos was the one thing the bosses refused to tolerate. 10. One of the most headache-inducing rules for a mobster was the absolute prohibition on writing anything down. Because a ledger is basically a signed confession for the prosecutor, wise guys had to memorize complex debts, loan shark rates, and bribery schedules entirely in their heads. It turned uneducated street guys into mental math geniuses out of sheer necessity. Imagine the stress of running $1 million empire where you couldn't even use a Post-it note to remember who owes you $5,000. If you forgot a number, you couldn't just look it up. You had to bluff your way through the meeting and hope you didn't accidentally shortchange yourself or start a war over a math error. 11. While they made millions flooding the streets with illegal gin and whiskey, the smart bosses strictly forbade their own inner circle from getting high on their own supply. Being a drunk was considered a massive liability because loose lips sink ships, and an intoxicated gangster is a security risk. There was a profound irony in running the largest alcohol distribution network in history, while sipping water or coffee at meetings to stay sharp. If a member started showing up to the club stumbling or slurring his words, he was quickly put on a forced sabbatical. They viewed alcohol as a product to be sold to the gullible public, not consumed by the management. 12. If you ever wondered why old photos of mobsters show them wearing three-piece suits even at a beach picnic, it is because of a strict dress code that forbade looking casual. A made man was expected to project power and dignity 24 hours a day, which meant no shorts, no t-shirts, and absolutely no sloppy attire in public. They believed that if they looked like bums, people would treat them like ones, and that was bad for business. You could be in the middle of a sweltering July heatwave in Brooklyn, and you were still expected to keep your jacket buttoned and your tie perfectly knotted. It is hilarious to imagine these tough guys sweating profusely just to maintain the image of a respectable businessman. 13. One of the smartest but strictly enforced rules was the absolute ban on kidnapping for ransom. After the media circus surrounding the Lindbergh baby, the federal government cracked down hard on kidnapping, making it a crime that brought too much heat. The mob bosses realized that snatching people brought the FBI to their doorstep, which disrupted their lucrative bootlegging operations. So they strictly forbade their crews from kidnapping anyone, viewing it as a dirty, amateur crime practiced by desperate thugs. It is a rare moment of corporate risk management where they decided that some crimes were simply not worth the paperwork. 14. Nicknames in the 20s were rarely chosen by the gangsters themselves. They were usually cruel descriptors given by the press or fellow mobsters that just stuck. You had guys walking around with names like Greasy Thumb, Chicken Head, or Three Finger Brown, and the rule was you just had to accept it. Al Capone absolutely hated being called Scarface and would explode if anyone used it to his face, preferring the much more dignified Snorky, which was slang for a sharp dresser. It is wildly funny that these terrifying men, who commanded armies of criminals, were powerless to stop people from calling them ridiculous names behind their backs. 15. Sunday dinner was not just a family tradition, it was a mandatory corporate meeting disguised as a meal. Missing a Sunday gathering with the extended family was seen as a sign of disrespect and potential disloyalty. The bosses believed that a man who didn't honor his mother's pasta couldn't be trusted with the family's money. It created this dual life where a mobster would spend 6 days a week running illegal gambling dens and avoiding the police, only to be terrified of being late for his grandmother's lasagna on the 7th day. It grounded their criminal empire in a strange domestic routine that prioritized tomato sauce over almost anything else. 16. The concept of the sit-down was a formal dispute resolution process that operated like a bizarrely strict corporate board meeting. If two mobsters had a problem, they couldn't just fight it out in the street. They had to request a sit-down with a neutral third party. There were rigid rules about who could speak first, where everyone sat, and the tone of voice used. It was an attempt to bring bureaucratic order to a chaotic criminal lifestyle. You literally had guys who broke the law for a living getting upset because someone didn't follow the proper parliamentary procedure during a meeting about territory rights. 17. One of the most paranoid but strictly followed habits was the refusal to ever sit with one's back to a door or a window. This wasn't just a movie cliché. It was a survival instinct that became a standard operating procedure for every meal and card game. A wise guy would awkwardly rearrange restaurant furniture or wait for a specific booth just to ensure he had a full view of the entrance. It made dining out with a group of mobsters a logistical nightmare, as everyone was vying for the seat with the best vantage point. It is amusing to picture a group of grown men playing musical chairs in a high-end restaurant just to satisfy their collective anxiety. 18. In an era of booming technology, the wise guys were essentially Luddites when it came to the telephone. They were rightfully paranoid that an operator might be listening, so discussing business on a landline was a strict taboo. If you had to make a call, you used a public booth and spoke in such heavy, ridiculous code that a simple pizza order sounded like a cryptic military operation. It is hilarious that these powerful bosses who controlled entire cities were reduced to sprinting down the block with a pocket full of dimes just to avoid saying anything incriminating on their home phone. 19. Getting injured on the job meant avoiding official hospitals like they were crime scenes. Doctors asked questions. Paperwork created trails. Trails led to indictments. So the mob built its own underground healthcare network, quiet backroom procedures, cash-only arrangements. No forms, no names, no memory of what happened. If something went wrong, it never existed. It created a surreal parallel universe where serious wounds were treated in complete silence, and the most important part of recovery wasn't the stitches. It was whether you kept your mouth shut afterward. 20. In the Roaring '20s, a man's fedora was practically glued to his head, and knocking it off was tantamount to a declaration of war. There was a weirdly specific etiquette about hat removal that signaled respect or aggression. You took it off for a made man of higher rank indoors, but if someone touched your brim without permission, it was a massive insult to your dignity. It is absurd to think that grown men who robbed banks for a living were more sensitive about their headwear placement than they were about the federal laws they broke every single day. 21. Managing a love life in the mob required the logistical skills of an air traffic controller due to the strict separation of wife and mistress. Friday nights were exclusively reserved for the girlfriend, known as the Guma, while Sundays were sacred for the wife and kids. Mixing these two worlds was the ultimate taboo that could get you exiled from the social circle. It resulted in a hilarious reality where tough gangsters spent half their week panic buying 2 different sets of flowers and perfumes, terrified that a receipt mix-up would cause more damage than any police raid ever could. 22. The Great Depression made everyone wary of banks, but the mob took financial paranoia to a comedic level by hoarding literal mountains of cash in burying spots. Trusting a bank teller was out of the question, so they stuffed millions into walls, under floorboards, and yes, inside actual mattresses. We aren't talking about a few dollars. We are talking about rotting piles of currency that sometimes got eaten by rats or molded from humidity. It is the ultimate irony that the wealthiest men in the city often lost their fortunes simply because they forgot which hole in the backyard contained the retirement fund. 23. One of the strangest rituals wasn't about violence or money. It was about physical proximity. Greetings were strategic. A handshake could be distant. A hug could signal loyalty. The length of eye contact mattered. Even the order in which people were acknowledged carried meaning. In a room full of mobsters, the greeting sequence functioned like a silent ranking system. Outsiders saw affection. Insiders saw hierarchy. A greeting done incorrectly wasn't awkward. It was suspicious. And in an organization obsessed with reading signals, suspicion spread faster than gossip at a wedding. 24. You might think being a psychopath was a job requirement, but the organization actually had a strict ban on behavior deemed too crazy or unpredictable. A guy who started fights for no reason or acted erratically was seen as a massive liability to the bottom line. The bosses wanted cold, calculated earners, not wild cowboys who drew attention. If a member started acting like a loose cannon, he was often sent to the countryside to cool off. It is a corporate HR policy applied to criminals, where being too enthusiastic about your violent job was actually grounds for immediate dismissal. 25. To combat the stereotype of being uneducated thugs, many bosses enforced a bizarre rule about attending the opera and high society theater events. It was a desperate attempt to whitewash their reputations and mingle with judges and politicians in plain sight. You had these rough, street-smart guys forcing themselves to sit through 3 hours of Italian arias just to appear cultured. It is a hilarious image of bored gangsters trying not to fall asleep in a private box seat, clapping politely while probably thinking about bootlegging routes and collection schedules the entire time. 26. Dining with the boss wasn't dinner. It was theater. When the Don sat at the table, he controlled more than territory. He controlled the atmosphere. He decided when the meal began. He initiated the first toast. He chose the conversation topics. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dominated. If he asked a question, you answered directly and briefly. It wasn't about food. It was about demonstrating order. Even casual laughter was calibrated. A restaurant table became a stage where everyone rehearsed their loyalty in real time, under chandeliers instead of streetlights. 27. Carrying a wallet was considered the mark of a civilian or a sucker, so wise guys strictly used what became known as the Chicago roll. The rule was to carry a massive wad of cash held together by a simple rubber band or a flashy diamond clip, kept in the front pocket for easy access. Fumbling with a leather wallet at a bar or a bribe situation was seen as slow and uncool. This habit was so ingrained that police could often identify a suspect just by checking if his money was folded in a specific way. It is funny that a 50-cent rubber band became a bigger status symbol in the underworld than a genuine leather billfold. 28. The smartest rule the mob followed was the "don't soil the nest" policy, which meant you never committed crimes in your own neighborhood. In fact, gangsters were expected to be model citizens on their home block, helping old ladies with groceries and tipping the local paperboy generously. They wanted the neighbors to see them as benevolent protectors rather than criminals, ensuring that nobody would call the cops if they saw something suspicious. It created a surreal neighborhood dynamic where the guy running a massive illegal lottery was also the most beloved figure at the local church bake sale because he bought all the cookies. 29. Finding a tailor was a tactical necessity because off-the-rack suits simply couldn't handle the hardware a mobster carried. There was a specific requirement for jackets to be altered with reinforced linings and wider cuts to conceal heavy revolvers without ruining the silhouette. A regular suit would sag or bulge, giving away the game, so tailors became some of the most trusted associates in the organization. These poor fashion designers were essentially structural engineers, trying to figure out how to make a tuxedo look elegant while it was supporting 4 pounds of steel and ammunition. It turns fashion into a matter of life and death where a tight fit could literally get you arrested. 30. Al Capone practically invented the modern public relations stunt by opening soup kitchens during the Great Depression. The rule was to win the hearts and minds of the public so that the average citizen would view the government as the villain and the mob as the hero. They served thousands of meals with a smile, strictly instructing their men to be polite and courteous to the homeless. It is a bizarre historical twist where the organization responsible for most of the city's corruption was also the most efficient charity in town, purely to make it harder for the jury to convict them later. 31. There was a strict behavioral rule that a man of respect never runs in public unless he is actually on fire. Running implies panic, guilt, or fear, and a made man was supposed to project total control and calmness at all times. Even if the police were turning the corner, you were expected to walk away at a brisk, dignified pace rather than sprint like a thief. It is a hilarious commitment to branding where looking cool was prioritized over avoiding capture. You could technically be fleeing a crime scene, but you had to do it with the casual swagger of a man who just remembered he left the stove on. 32. Vouching for someone wasn't a recommendation, it was a liability contract written in blood. If you introduced a new face into the family circle, you weren't just saying he was trustworthy. You were attaching your reputation to every move he made from that moment forward. If he earned well, you looked strong. If he embarrassed the organization, your name came up in the same sentence. That kind of pressure created a ruthless screening process. Before you vouched for someone, you had to ask yourself one brutal question: am I willing to tie my future to his judgment? 33. There was a fascinating neutral ground rule regarding vacations, specifically in Hot Springs, Arkansas. This town was declared an open city where rival mobsters from New York and Chicago could relax without fear of being attacked. It was strictly forbidden to conduct business or violence there, turning it into a surreal playground where sworn enemies would politely tip their hats to each other in the hotel lobby. You could literally see Al Capone playing golf a few yards away from a guy who tried to kill him the week before, both of them adhering to a bizarre truce just so they could enjoy the thermal baths in peace. 34. There was a fascinating unwritten rule about never accepting a free meal or a complimentary drink from anyone outside the family. In the Mafia worldview, everything is a transaction, and accepting a gift creates a debt that might need to be repaid later. To avoid owing favors to civilians or random shopkeepers, mobsters would aggressively overtip and pay for everything in cash, often flashing huge rolls of bills. It was a power move to show that they were the providers, not the charity cases. It effectively turned a simple spaghetti dinner into a complex display of dominance, where paying the check was the most important part of the evening. 35. Golf became the surprising sport of choice for the underworld, not because they enjoyed the exercise, but because of a tactical rule about privacy. A golf course is a wide-open space with no walls for microphones and no bushes for police to hide in. The bosses realized that the middle of a fairway was the safest place to discuss sensitive criminal conspiracies without being overheard. So, these unathletic, cigar-smoking city boys forced themselves to learn the game, hacking away at the grass for 4 hours just so they could plan their next move without the feds listening in. 36. There was a strict, unwritten rule about the wife's car versus the boss's car. While the mobster drove a flashy, custom-painted Cadillac to show off his power, his wife was required to drive a modest, unassuming vehicle to avoid drawing heat to the suburban home. It was a strange attempt at camouflage where the driveway would feature a bulletproof limousine parked next to a sensible family sedan. They wanted the neighbors to think the husband was just a successful salesman, creating a bizarre suburban pantomime where the family pretended to be middle class while the husband was wearing a suit worth more than the house. 37. Bribery was so institutionalized that the smart organizations treated it like a fixed monthly utility bill rather than a one-time expense. There was a rule to budget for police payoffs exactly the same way a legitimate business budgets for electricity or rent. They didn't just bribe cops when they got caught. They put the local precinct on a retainer fee to look the other way preemptively. It is a level of corporate bureaucratic thinking applied to crime that is almost admirable. They literally had accounting columns for law enforcement salaries, effectively turning the police force into their own private security contractors. 38. The mob developed a paranoid rule about never being the first person to start eating at a restaurant table. This wasn't just politeness. It was a survival tactic to ensure the food wasn't tampered with. The lower-ranking soldiers were expected to dig in first, acting as unofficial taste testers for the boss. If the guys at the bottom of the table didn't keel over after the first bite of spaghetti, then the Don would pick up his fork. It turned every celebratory dinner into a subtle game of Russian roulette where the appetizers served as a biological safety check for the management. 39. While the world saw them as stone-cold killers, the mob actually had an incredibly weird superstition about spilling salt at the dinner table. If a wise man knocked over the shaker, he was strictly required to throw a pinch over his left shoulder immediately to ward off bad luck and the devil. This wasn't a joke. Grown men with Tommy guns would stop a serious conversation about territory to perform this ritual. It is hilarious that a guy who fearlessly breaks federal laws daily is terrified of a few grains of sodium chloride landing on the tablecloth. 40. One of the most bizarre rules involved a specific hatred for purple cars, which was considered the color of bad luck and death in the Italian superstitious tradition. A mobster would never be caught dead driving a purple vehicle, and if an associate bought one, it was seen as a sign that he was marked for a funeral. This color phobia was so strong that even a dark maroon could get side-eye from the older bosses. It is funny to imagine a ruthless criminal panic-selling his brand-new luxury car just because the paint job was a shade too close to violet. 41. There was a grim but practical rule about always carrying enough cash to cover your own funeral, known as the burial roll. Mobsters lived with the constant reality that they could be killed at any moment, and they considered it a massive disgrace to be buried in a pauper's grave or to leave the financial burden to their wives. So even the lowest-ranking soldiers would walk around with a specific wad of bills in a separate pocket that was strictly forbidden to touch, no matter how broke they were. It is a morbid kind of financial planning where your emergency fund is exclusively reserved for buying your own coffin. 42. Despite their violent careers, many mobsters maintained a strict ritual of religious discipline. Church wasn't optional. Major holidays were observed. Public displays of faith were carefully maintained. It wasn't about hypocrisy in their minds. It was compartmentalization. They genuinely believed business was business and faith was faith. You could negotiate illegal deals all week, but on Sunday, you were expected to kneel, confess, and show visible devotion. It created a surreal double life where moral boundaries were sliced cleanly in half, depending on which building you were standing in. 43. The mob strictly forbade the use of nicknames in front of civilians or wives to maintain a veneer of respectability. If you were at a family gathering, you addressed a notorious killer as Mr. Rossi or Uncle Tony, never Tony the Ant or Jimmy Two Guns. This code switching was essential for keeping the domestic sphere blissfully ignorant of the violence. It created a funny situation where terrifying enforcers had to pretend to be boring uncles discussing the weather, just to keep the peace at a birthday party. 44. The most dangerous mistake a mobster could make wasn't disloyalty, it was overshadowing the boss. Status had to flow upward. If the Don arrived in a tailored suit, yours had better look sharp but slightly less impressive. If he drove a luxury car, yours needed to be respectable, not superior. Success was encouraged, but never competitive. Looking too ambitious in public signaled future problems. In this ecosystem, perception was power, and if you looked like you were rising too fast, the organization had a way of slowing things down permanently. So after all that, here's the uncomfortable question. If we stripped away the illegal part and kept the structure, how many of these rules still exist today in business, politics, even your own workplace? And more importantly, what did we miss? Which mafia rule should have been on this list but wasn't? Don't lurk. Add it. If this made you see organized crime as the strictest management course in history, hit like, subscribe, and let's see who's paying attention.